Good morning, everybody. I'm Helen Chesshire from the Woodland Trust, and I'd very much like to welcome you to the Woodland Trust session on ancient and veteran trees. And I hope you found that short film as you were arriving inspirational. Many of these beautiful trees are found on farmland. So with our expert speakers today, I hope you'll have an opportunity to learn more about how to recognise these wonderful trees and how to manage them to benefit both your farm and the trees themselves. We have 4 speakers who will each give a presentation lasting 10 to 12 minutes. So this will leave us plenty of time for questions and discussion. So do pop your questions into the chat as we go along and make sure you've got plenty of them at the end. So our first speaker should have been Dr. Emma Gilmartin, one of my colleagues, but unfortunately she's not very well, so has pre-recorded her presentation. So we will use her presentation to show you how to recognise ancient and veteran trees and the features to look out for on them. Our second speaker is Dr. Catherine Jones, who's the Farm Wildlife Project Manager at the RSPB. And she will talk about the biodiversity benefits of ancient and veteran trees and what advice is available to provide you to help manage these trees. Our third speaker is Professor Gareth, Griffith, Chair of Mycology at the Aberystwyth University. He will focus on the life beneath our veteran and ancient trees, and in particular soils and mycorrhizal fungi, and highlight the impact farming practices can have. We also have my colleague Louise, who will share her experiences as an advisor to farmers from the Sherwood Forest area of Nottinghamshire, an area which has lots of arable production, which sits within a landscape that's famous for its ancient and veteran trees, as well as its wood pasture. She will share her work on surveying these trees in this arable setting, as well as sharing the challenges and solutions of managing trees in this agricultural landscape. So as you listen to the speakers, it would be good to consider how you think that the ELM, or the new Environmental Land Management Scheme in England, might be able to support these veteran and ancient trees. And for those of you coming from other devolved countries, how similar schemes could support the management and protection of these trees. So with no further ado, Kath, if you're ready, could you upload Emma's pre-recorded presentation, please?
Some of the most special trees we call ancient trees or veteran trees. These two words have similar meanings. We often use them interchangeably, but sometimes we need to use them separately. So what are they? Ancient trees are trees that are very old. This means that they have a
Has the sound just stopped? Apologies if it has.
Yes, it has.
It stopped when I pressed mute. I'm not sure why, bear with me. I'm going to stop sharing and try again, bear with me.
It might be simpler just to leave yourself not muted, Louise, and that way
Yeah.
we won't have that problem.
I shall do that. I'm going to start it from where it was.
Okay, thank you.
age in the number of years that have passed since the tree first came to life, and they are old relative to other trees of that same species. This relative age is important as not all tree species typically have the same average lifespans. You can reasonably expect, for example, an oak tree to live longer than, say, a birch tree. And ancient trees are in the ancient phase of their lives. They are showing particular signs of aging. This is an example on the left of the lovely curly oak in Windham Forest in South Wales. By contrast, a veteran tree is a mature tree, and it might not be very old in the absolute number of years lived, but it is starting to get some of the features of ancient trees, starting to show signs of having lived a little bit of life, you know? On the right here then is a veteran oak. It is perhaps shorter than it was when it first grew tall at maturity, and it is showing other signs of natural damage. The word veteran is very much a metaphor. Think of a battle-scarred veteran that has survived various traumatic events of life. This one shows signs of a historic lightning strike down its trunk. Where are they found? Well, really simply, they are found anywhere and everywhere. You can find special trees in all corners of the UK. Anywhere that trees have been afforded adequate space, spreading room, light, and the opportunity, in conditions and care that have allowed them to live on and grow old somewhat gracefully. Here is just one example in an urban area. This is the Crouch Oak in Adelston, Surrey. It is said to once have marked the boundary to Windsor Forest. This tree may have been a fine tree at the time of Queen Elizabeth I, so you can imagine about the great and the good who might have enjoyed this tree back then. However, towns and cities have grown up and around old trees. This one now sits on the edge of a residential road, and some people, I hope, now enjoy the view of this amazing ancient oak. Somewhere else that you can find ancient trees are in churchyards, and indeed in the UK, yews are particularly associated with these. They're actually the subject of much interest and study. Some people like to investigate how old they are and how they relate to the church buildings. Do they predate them? Often there's a really rich history and science to explore there. This one is the Beltingham Yew in Northumberland. You do sometimes find ancient trees with these metal belts around them. This is to keep them from falling over or collapsing. This tree actually had its belt removed recently. I think it's due a new fitting, but that's another story. You can find ancient and veteran trees in woodland and in wood pastures. These are the spectacular ancient pollarded beeches of Epping Forest. They are lapsed or perhaps retired pollards. These trees used to be routinely cut above head height for their leaves, for animal fodder, or for wood by commoners. This practice of pollarding stopped here around 150 years ago, so the new growth on the tops of these beech trees are 150 to 200 years old, and the supporting trunks are very much older. And they may certainly be found in the farmed environment. Farming in Britain spans such a variety of climate, topography and practice that the species and forms of ancient and veteran trees on farms is equally diverse. This is just one example called the Drive Oak that has looked on and over the entrance to this farm in Gloucestershire. So yes, ancient and veteran trees are truly found UK-wide in towns, cities, churchyards and woodlands, but definitely also on farmland, in pastures, in your hedgerows, in orchards and around your farm buildings. So you might be legitimately wondering, do I have any ancient and veteran trees on my farm or nearby? The main thing that I want you to take away from me is to look out for these three things to help you identify special trees. Look out for trees that are old, are large, or are full of features or habitats and places for wildlife to live. Let's look at these each in more detail. The first thing to look out for is evidence of age. So of course some trees really do look old, and you can walk past trees that look interesting and gnarly and short and squat, and in lots of cases this will help you to spot special trees. You would certainly pass this tree here on the left and think, yes, this is an old tree. This is Windham's oak in Dorset. A man named Judge or Sir Windham lived in the manor nearby in the 1600s, and he reportedly sat and admired his view from within the hollow of this tree. We know from writings in the late 1700s that even back then this was an old-looking tree, and it was thought to predate the biblical flood. On the right, though, is a historic map from the 1800s, where this same tree is actually marked on the map, and it is named Windham's Oak. Now, naming trees is important. We tend not to name just any trees. Clearly, this has been a significant tree for some time. So, as well as visual clues about a tree looking and feeling old, we have historical evidence pointing to its ancientness. And here is another example. On the left here we have a photo from 1901 from a farmer in mid-Wales called Mervyn Jones. This is a photo from the wedding of Mervyn's great-aunt Polly. So here is evidence of a family wedding on the farm in front of a much-loved tree. I'm not sure the tree had a name then, but here on the right is a present-day photo of the same tree on the same farm, now called the Brimham Oak. And it came to everyone's attention when it was proposed that a new road bypassing Newtown, should be built right next to the tree and threaten it as a result. Thankfully, the tree is still with us despite the road. Next, you should notice trees when they are very large. So do look out for ones that stand out in their environment and from others, especially from other trees that are nearby and are of the same species. This tree on the left is one large veteran cherry that I encountered a few months back on a farm. And exceptional size is something that a tree can only achieve if it has been growing for centuries. The one on the right here is called the Bowthorpe Oak, and if you wrap a tape measure around its trunk, it measures over 12.3 metres in girth. Now, interestingly, there are only just over 100 oak trees in England that are over 9 metres in girth. So at 12.3 metres, this tree, sat on a farm in Lincolnshire, is in fact one of the largest in the country. But recognising special trees by their size is one that can sometimes catch you out. So there are two important points to remember here. You must be mindful that some tree species have a smaller stature than others. Think of a rowan, a hazel, a hawthorn, and that they are often far smaller than an oak or a beech. And be mindful of growing conditions. When conditions are good, trees can grow fast and large fairly quickly. But in harsh conditions, in the uplands and indeed on rock faces, trees can grow very slowly. And globally, the most ancient of trees are ones that are growing in these harsh conditions. So, just because a tree is small doesn't mean that it can't be ancient. And finally, you can recognise ancient and veteran trees by the features that they have. The surest way is to spot trunk and branch hollowing. This is a vital and natural part of the ageing of trees. It isn't a sign of ill health, rather the recycling of wood that serves no function in the tree after a while. Related to this is other wood decay. Look for decay throughout the tree. This is hollowing in action, and the decaying wood becomes soft or crumbly or spongy and is very valuable for wildlife. And look for fungi. The mushrooms and brackets on trees are the fruiting structures of fungi that are decaying the wood in the trunk and larger branches. These are not signs of disease, but they indicate that the natural and helpful and essential recycling of nutrients and carbon is taking place. Some further features to note. Look for decaying wood in the crown. On the left here, you can see this tree has a number of large, dead, attached branches. These are great, important habitats and indicators of a veteran tree. Also look for decaying wood that has arisen from the tree and is now lying on the ground. The wood from this ancient ash is no longer attached to the tree, but it still is really valuable if left in situ, just as it is. And also there are other things such as rot holes, water pockets, flaking bark, sap runs, cracks and crevices that all add to the value of these trees. As I wrap up, I should mention our ancient tree inventory. Now, the Woodland Trust maintains a large living database of ancient, veteran and other notable trees across the UK. The website is shown here, and it grows every day with over 120,000 tree records on the inventory. Anyone can record a tree to it, however it is also curated by our staff and with the help of expert volunteers. So if you're wondering about your tree, is it ancient or veteran, do go ahead and record it, or go looking for it. Check the map to see if someone else has already recorded it for you. You can add a tree. There is a tree search function with an interactive map where you can also look at the historic maps too. And as I mentioned, once a tree is recorded, we will go to the effort of verifying that tree. We'll take a look at it, possibly pay it a visit and confirm that a tree is all that we think it is. If this is something that interests you, it is also worth mentioning that we have a great deal of resources to help you learn more about ancient and veteran trees and about how to record them. We have lots of guidance on the Ancient Tree Inventory website and also on our Woodland Trust YouTube. We've recently launched a series of 5 videos all about recording, and these are really nice and accessible watches, and I do recommend those. And remember these 3 things to look out for to help you recognise ancient and veteran trees. Are they old or old looking? Are they large or are they full of habitat and decay features? If your trees have any of these signs, consider recording them to the Ancient Tree Inventory. Thanks for your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of the session and the rest of the conference.
Well, thank you to Emma in her absence. That was a great, I thought, great recording, and I hope that's inspired you to go out and look to see what trees you might have. So now I'd like to hand over to Catherine. Thank you.
Sorry about that today. Right, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. This section of the Ancient and Veteran Trees talk highlights the biodiversity associated with ancient and veteran trees. These are often hidden assets in the farm landscape that provide valuable resources for wildlife and also for people. So I work for the Farm Wildlife project, which is a partnership of organisations working together to provide a single source of advice for wildlife on farmland. The farm wildlife approach brings together best practice advice from a broad range of wildlife organisations, identifying the most important steps for restoring nature in the farmed landscape. Farm Wildlife works with farmers, including the Nature Friendly Farming Network and Fair to Nature, to deliver wildlife-friendly habitats across the wider farm and across the landscape. Right, so back to the ancient and veteran trees and biodiversity. So ancient and veteran trees provide special environments. They provide fissures and flaking bark, water pockets, sap runs, soft decaying wood, crevices, holes and hollows, and these take time to replicate. It has been estimated that 13% of all species of plants and animals are dependent on deadwood habitat. 2,300 species of wildlife are supported by oak. 229 species are rarely found on trees other than oak, and 326 species depend on oak for survival. And as oaks can live for more than 1,000 years, this just shows how important they are. So from the top to the bottom, from the buds and leaves in the canopy to the roots spread across the ground, ancient, veteran, mature and young trees provide food and shelter for wildlife. They provide something to eat and somewhere to live. So fungi. Fungi are really important in this process as they are the main drivers of wood decay. They play a key role in creating habitat. The beefsteak fungus shown on the left and the chicken of the woods fungus shown in the centre are the principal heart rotters of oak and also sweet chestnut, producing the red rot that is important for so many invertebrate species. And the birch polypore on the right produces red rot in birch. The birch polypore is also a food source for some species, such as a beetle that I will show you later that actually uses it as a food source. Birds also benefit from ancient and veteran trees. The tree canopy provides shelter and insect prey for woodland birds such as great tits, blue tits, coal tits and flycatchers. And large trunks provide crevices and holes for birds to nest, owls and woodpeckers and redstarts. On the left, we have a lesser woodpecker, which is able to actually excavate a hole, make a hole larger, and a redstart that also nests in cavities in ancient trees. Ancient and veteran trees are also important for mammals. They provide shelter, nesting sites, burrows and roosts for many mammals. Small mammals such as squirrels, dormice, voles and other mice, and particularly important for bats, bechsteins, leicesters, and pipistrelles use trees for roosts, foraging, and also for hibernation. And the two priority species shown here, the grey long-eared bat on the left, roosts and nests in ancient trees, and the greater horseshoe bat on the right, forages in woodland. Ancient and veteran trees are particularly important for invertebrates. Saproxylic invertebrates, that's those associated with dead and decaying wood, including woodlice, millipedes, and insects, primarily beetles, particularly at the larval stage, use these habitats. And these insects, these invertebrates, process dead and decaying material and therefore recycle nutrients, an important benefit for us. So the images here by Andy Skinner show a clearwing hornet, a day-flying moth, which actually eats wood. On the bottom, we have a range of beetles. The small beetle that I mentioned earlier that actually feeds on the birch polypore, a stag beetle, a couple of longhorn beetles, and a rhinoceros beetle. So a wide range of beetles use these habitats. Parasitic and predatory insects also use dead wood. On the left, we have an ichneumon wasp. In the center, we have a ladybird sheltering in a tree. And on the right, we have a jewel wasp, a parasitoid of solitary bees. So these parasitic insects that often prey on beetle larvae and these predatory insects provide natural pest control, another benefit to us that these insects provide. And finally, the pollinating insects. Social bees and social wasps often nest in the cavities in trees. Bumblebees, like the tree bumblebee, or a feral colony of honeybees can be found in trees. Wasps, social wasps, such as the common hornet or the European hornet, may also nest in trees. Solitary bees, such as the leafcutter bee in the center, not only use the trees for their nests, they also use the leaves to line their nest cells. And hoverflies, this is a Batman hoverfly on the right. Some hoverfly larvae develop in small pools of water, hoverfly hollows, in dead and decaying wood or tree cavities. So what advice does farm wildlife offer with regard to ancient and veteran trees? Initially, we would ask you to identify existing habitat features on your farm, such as ancient and veteran trees, which are really wildlife-rich features. Field boundaries also contain ancient and veteran trees, and these well-managed boundary features can support wildlife and also connect habitats across the landscape. Wet features I've also highlighted. Things like the pools within the trees or ponds and ditches are also very important for a wide range of wildlife. Water is crucial to wildlife. And within the farmed area, management of field trees, ancient and veteran trees within the farmed area provides habitat stepping stones between other features. Looking after existing features such as ancient and veteran trees should be a priority for wildlife-friendly farming. So what can you do? These are a few things that you can do to help wildlife and our ancient and veteran trees. So firstly, as Emma mentioned in her presentation earlier, identify ancient and veteran trees and protect them. You can use the farm wildlife approach to identify existing habitat features, and you can follow the Woodland Trust's guiding principles for ancient and veteran tree management. So firstly, give the tree space and the opportunity to continue growing. Avoid damage within the root protection area. This is something that Louise will talk about more later. Retain and value dead trees and decaying wood. This is particularly important for invertebrates, the small things that run the planet. And look to the future. Which trees will be the ancient and veteran trees of the future? And finally, you can use the Woodland Trust practical guidance for ancient and veteran trees and care for the special trees on your farm. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Catherine. And my colleague Catherine has put the links to that, to the guides and to the website into the chat for you. So now over to Gareth for his talk.
Right, I'll proceed. Yeah, so thank you to the Woodland Trust for the invitation to speak at this session. I guess I should introduce my particular interests. I'm going to talk about soils, mycorrhizal fungi, and farmland trees today, but I should confess that my main interest, research-wise, has been on the conservation of grassland fungi. These are the wax caps that you'll find in unploughed, low-nutrient pastures. I think most of you might have heard of wax cap fungi, but maybe you're not aware of how rare they are at a global level and how important the British Isles are as a global hotspot for these fungi. There are about 15 of these, the 40 species that we have in the UK, are actually assessed as vulnerable in the IUCN's Red List. And for comparison, that's the same level of extinction risk that is placed on the great panda and the snow leopard. So we kind of need to appreciate how these grasslands that might be botanically a bit mundane because they've been heavily grazed by sheep, but the soils contain extremely valuable biodiversity. And as with the panda and the leopard, extinction threat is mostly due to habitat loss. And as you can see in this picture here, you can see the nearby field is rich in waxcap biodiversity, whereas the further fields that have been ploughed and reseeded for sheep agriculture you won't find any waxcaps on those. So before I go towards trees, I thought I'd mention how in the present age we study soil fungi. For waxcaps, it's moderately easy. If you go out in October, you can find the beautiful coloured fruit bodies. But most of the biomass of waxcaps and all the other fungi in the soil are hard to see. So we've developed a method using eDNA metabarcoding is the technical term. eDNA stands for environmental DNA. And the way we do this is we will identify a quadrat, as you can see in the top left, and we'll use a soil auger and take cores on a 5-meter grid and collect about a ½ kilo of soil, which we freeze dry, and we extract DNA from it. And then we do various processes like PCR, which is you're all familiar with now because probably a good number of you have had a COVID test. It's not that dissimilar from a COVID PCR assay. It's just that we core the soil rather than swabbing a nose. We've used this method in sort of agriculturally relevant situations, as you can see, sort of towards the bottom right, and this was bottom left, and this was looking at various soil rotations and how they affect the soil biodiversity. And the area that's of these various bar charts here, these bar charts is the kind of result we get from these analyses, where we get a full species list of all the fungi present, and it also tells us how much of the different species is present. So I've highlighted one part of this rather complicated bar chart just to show you that we can find a clear effect in an arable field if you do direct drill as opposed to ploughing on a wheat crop. And we can also see these effects are long term. So you can detect the effects of soil rotation. You can see what previous cover crops you had there. But we can apply this method to various other scenarios. So we can look at the bacteria in the soil. We can also work out what plants are there because we extract DNA from the roots in the soil. And we can do other things like aerobiology. We can collect spores from the air and so forth. But the main thing I want to talk to you today about are mycorrhizas, because all farmers are aware of mycorrhizas and their potential benefits, but are possibly not clear about what exactly they do. The cover of this wonderful book by Sally Smith and David Reed is the Bible of mycorrhizal biology. And here you can see a little pine seedling here, and you can see its roots extending into the soil, and the white stuff you can see are the mycorrhizal fungi associated with the roots. And what's happening here is that the fungus is foraging in the soil and picking up nutrients, in particular nitrogen and phosphorus, but they can be important in water uptake as well, and they transfer these to the plant in exchange for sugar. So if anybody ever tells you that plants have roots, you can correct them and tell them, well, no, plants have mycorrhizas, because these things aren't just in a few plants, they're in all plants. Now you might wonder why do plants not just develop more extensive root systems? Well, the reason for that is, first of all, that plants aren't carbon limited. And that's kind of obvious, because if you put fertilizer on a field, you get more growth. So it's not photosynthesis that limits their growth, it's nutrient availability. They could develop more extensive root systems, but fungi are fundamentally better at doing this because they can produce narrower hyphae. Their cells are narrower, and if you have a narrower cell, it's more efficient at taking up nutrients. And the final thing that's important, a unique thing that fungi can do, is they can secrete enzymes, and these enzymes can break down organic matter in the soil and solubilize the nutrients and transfer them to the plants. So that's the basis of why the mycorrhizal symbiosis has evolved. So now moving on to sort of soil more generally, that the role of mycorrhizas in soil is to recycle the nutrients as the organic matter is being degraded. They can pick up the nutrients, the nitrogen and the phosphorus, and transfer it back to the crop plants. However, in modern agriculture, if you apply synthetic fertilizers, what you essentially do then is to increase the supply of nitrogen or phosphorus in the soil, and that devalues the currency of the mycorrhizas. So you get less extensive mycorrhizal networks. The other thing that agriculture involves very often is ploughing. Now, at some level, some ploughing, which is mainly there to sort of bury the weeds, if you like, so that you've got fresh growth, you've got bare soil, and the breaking up of the clods of soil also encourages organic matter decomposition. The mycorrhizal networks are disrupted by this, but they can reform fairly quickly over the course of the season. So that doesn't necessarily ruin, you don't have to direct drill that ploughing is compatible with mycorrhizal function. As I mentioned, one of the effects of ploughing is to increase the rate of decomposition of soil organic matter, which is important for soil fertility. But if with very deep ploughing and excessive ploughing in combination with synthetic fertilizers is undertaken for many years, you end up with soil organic matter depletion. And when the soil organic matter content goes below about a couple of %, then the soil starts to fail, because you get a loss of soil structure, the ability of the soil to retain water, moisture, and also to resist sort of flood events as well is compromised. So in the long term, sort of successful, sustainable agriculture needs to really, it needs to focus on very careful management of soils to maintain this delicate balance. You want to have rapid decomposition of organic matter, but you don't want to have depletion of organic matter, which is why you have to have re-addition of organic matter into the soil. For instance, cover crops are good at doing that. You see the picture here of this book that's 70 years old this year, Soils and Civilization by Edward Hiams. This is a really good example of, he has various chapters in this book that show how different past civilizations have failed, and often, in his argument, it's because they failed to manage their agricultural systems properly. And in some parts of the present day now, we have the same thing happening. So a key part of understanding soil function and preserving and maintaining soils is to appreciate mycorrhizal function and their role in plant nutrition. So moving now to trees and the role of trees in the farmed landscape. Well, the most obvious thing to be careful of is to avoid damaging the roots of the trees. You can see in this photo on the top left that the roots can extend quite a long way out beyond the drip line of the tree. And on the top right, you can see an example of a rather unhappy old oak. It's a hollowed oak, and it's got, I don't know if it's appreciable in this photo, but you can get 2 or 3 people into the hollow within that tree. Here is the plough line. It's even below, it's within the drip line here, whereas where the farmer should have ploughed was much further away to preserve this area where the roots are, to avoid damage to the roots of the oak tree. You can find out more about these best farming practices, in particular with regard to ploughing and so forth, in the Ancient and Veteran Trees book that the Wildlife Trust has published, which Catherine mentioned as well. Another thing that's also worth being careful about is if a farmer is fertilizing the ploughed area, to make sure there's no drift of fertilizer or farmyard manure onto the soil area where the roots are, because that will devalue the mycorrhizas of the tree and change the mycorrhizal populations of the tree, which won't be to the benefit of the tree. You can see these couple of photos here, which are rather extreme examples where a muck spreader has splattered muck onto the bark of trees, and this person here who's trying to scrape the muck off is trying to protect a rare lichen that grows on this tree. And I thank Ray Woods for this photo. And below, the bottom right photo shows fertilizer granules that have been thrown onto the bark of a tree and will have a massive effect on the bark lichens on that tree, and also the soil fungi around the tree as well, on the roots. So a little bit more detail about the fungal partners, the mycorrhizas that different plants have. Not all plants have the same mycorrhizas. In arable crops or grassland habitats, it's usually the arbuscular mycorrhizas, which are microscopic. You can't see them without a microscope to go and have a look at the roots. But if you look very carefully, you see the spores of these fungi, which you can see in the top right photo. These spores are maybe about 1/4 millimeter across. But the important bits to note aren't really the spores, it's this mycelial network that you see around the spores that's extending into the soil and foraging for nutrients. Also important is the way that the fungus is able to transfer the nutrients efficiently to the host plant. And if you look with a microscope, you can see, as in the top left, you can see the network of hyphae inside the root. Remember what I said earlier about plants don't have roots, they have mycorrhizas. So mycorrhiza means fungus root from Greek. And inside the individual cells of the root, you can find these little structures which have a high surface area, and they maximize the exchange of sugar to the fungus and nutrients to the plant. So these arbuscular mycorrhizas, they get their name because they form these little microscopic trees called arbuscules inside the root. However, if you look at trees, many or most trees, especially conifers, oaks, beeches, and so forth, that are widespread in the British Isles, they have a different type of mycorrhiza with a more obvious fungus. For example, this fly agaric is a well-known ectomycorrhizal fungi associated with birch and various conifers. And that has a different, simpler structure, whereas here you see a cross-section of the root in the middle lower photo. You can see the root in the middle, and it's got this sheath of fungal hyphae around the outside called the mantle. So these aren't quite as, they haven't evolved for quite as long a period as the arbuscular mycorrhizas, so they're not quite as efficient in their nutrient transfer mechanisms, but they nevertheless are important. And a single oak tree could have 20, 30 species of different mycorrhizal fungi on it, and the number of mycorrhizal fungi will increase as the oak tree ages. Now, the advent of all this DNA-based technology has greatly advanced our knowledge of what fungi are associated with different types of plants. And we're now aware that there aren't just these two types of mycorrhiza, there are quite a lot of other ones. For example, there's a fungus called Serendipita. And you can see in the bottom right photo, it's the effect of the Serendipita mycorrhiza on the growth of a plant under nitrogen and phosphorus limitation. So it's supplying both nitrogen and phosphorus to the plant in these circumstances. And if you look microscopically at this one, you can see there are hyphae in the roots, and there are these strange structures within the roots. They're not actually fluorescent, they're not luminescent like that. This is using fluorescence microscopy to study the distribution of these fungi. Okay, so the reason why the Woodland Trust asked me to speak is because I was fortunate enough to have a project funded by the Woodland Trust, which hasn't actually yet started. And the question we want to ask in this project is, in a wood pasture habitat, you clearly have the sort of woodland soil, if you like, where the roots of the tree are, and the ectomycorrhizal fungi are present and important there. And in the pasture areas, if the land hasn't been improved, you have essentially a grassland soil, and you're going to have your arbuscular mycorrhizas and also waxcap fungi. So they, between them, the waxcap fungi are also mycorrhizal. So in combination, you have quite important biodiversity and quite important fungi here for the health of the plant community. And the question we wanted to ask here was what happens in between at the ecotone. The ecotone is the shift between these two communities, where you have a shift between a woodland soil and a grassland soil. So we don't know the answer to this. Maybe next year I can come back and tell you what we found. But the reason why we want to do this is, one, so that promotion of woodland habitats doesn't imperil important grassland habitats. And also it's quite likely that there is sort of distinctive biodiversity associated with these wood pastures. A really good example of this, if anybody lives nearby Wrexham, is Chirk Castle and Baddy Park, where you have this ancient wood pasture there and some spectacular grassland fungi, as well as very important fungi associated with the oak trees with their roots, and also decay fungi on the wood. So I think my time has come to an end, so I should just summarize a few take-home messages. That mycorrhizal fungi are crucial for soil fertility, and you have to be careful if you use synthetic fertilizers, because you diminish the extent and health of the mycorrhizal community with synthetic fertilizers. However, healthy trees and all plants need healthy mycorrhizas, and wood pasture parkland shouldn't be forgotten about, because it's a very valuable farmed habitat from the perspective of biodiversity, with the older trees having more complex and distinct symbiont communities. So don't just look at the stuff you see above ground. Remember that in the soil, there is a huge amount of biodiversity, which is also important for plant fertility. And from a practical perspective, it's important to avoid tree root damage and fertilizer drift, as I've shown, and also to be careful about soil compaction. And lastly, even if your field is botanically very mundane, don't forget the grassland fungi. If the soil is healthy, they will be there. And thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Gareth. That was really interesting, and has obviously stimulated quite a few questions in the chat. And now over to my colleague Louise.
Brilliant. So I'm Louise Hackett. I work for the Woodland Trust. I currently lead on one of our treescapes, which are priority landscapes that we have identified across the UK, where we're focusing our kind of efforts and resources to look at landscape scale conservation. So Sherwood Forest is usually better known for this chap, Robin Hood, but also very much so for its concentration of ancient and veteran trees. This is probably the most famous of them all. It's the major oak. If you haven't already visited the major oak, I thoroughly recommend visiting it. It's a spectacular tree, and has a long history of being visited as a tourist attraction. In fact, one of the earliest kind of recordings of the tree was from 1790 by Major Rooke, who drew this illustration and for which the tree is now named the Major Oak after him. It's a landscape that's also lost many of its significant trees. So here we have Robin Hood's Larder, Seven Sisters, and the Greendale Oak. These are trees that have been lost in this landscape, but were very significant trees and named for that reason. Greendale Oak, for example, was famous for having this hollow cut through it, so a horse and cart could be driven through, or 3 horse riders abreast, and was most likely the reason this tree was lost, but very significant and an important part of this landscape's history. So just briefly to cover the area that I cover, so I work to the national character area boundary. So England as a landscape has been split into national character areas, and I focus on this one, which is Sherwood in Nottinghamshire. And this boundary roughly also coincides with the historic boundary of what Sherwood Forest would have once been, which was very much defined by its soil. So below us we have Sherwood's sandstone, and that obviously leads to predominantly sandy soils across this landscape, and that's very much why this landscape has a long history of being wood pasture. So obviously sandy soils are acidic, poor in nutrients, and historically therefore were not very good for agriculture, apart from at small scale. So it has a long history of being wood pasture, but obviously with the modern agricultural advances in technology, slowly this landscape has shifted to predominantly arable agriculture, interspersed with oak, birch, woodland, where we find some significant ancient and veteran trees, and also plantation forestry. So Emma mentioned in her presentation the ancient tree inventory. So this is an inventory, a national UK-wide inventory that we host. It was developed through a project that I actually started out working on the Trust 12 years ago, and it's older than that, 15 years I think now, since it began. It's a citizen science database whereby anyone can record a tree, as Emma outlined in her talk, and also partner organisations share their data, such as National Trust and other large landowners and estates. And any private landowner can record their trees as well. So as I said, this is a landscape famous for ancient and veteran trees, and we have this big concentration in the north. So you can see in that the kind of aerial photograph, we've got over 3,000 trees recorded in the north of this landscape, but only 329 in the wider landscape. And it's very much more wooded in the northern area, and has a kind of more recent history of being managed as wood pasture. The rest of the landscape is very much dominated now by arable agriculture. But that's not to say that we don't still have really important trees in this wider landscape. Obviously, a lot of that land is private, and therefore people aren't going to be coming across these trees in day-to-day life because there isn't that access. So one of the challenges is with this database is that where we don't have records, it doesn't necessarily tell us that there aren't ancient and veteran trees. It just most likely means that area hasn't been recorded. So through some funding that we've secured through the Green Challenge Fund, I'm piloting a project here in Sherwood whereby we're doing systematic surveys. So what I'm calling a blind survey. So I'm not working to the ancient tree inventory and what records there currently are, but I'm doing a systematic survey of land holdings. So I'm surveying an entire land holding. So I'm walking, so I'm working with farmers and other landowners to walk the entire area that has tree cover. So I'm not making any assumptions as to where I will or won't find trees. and I'm walking that entire area and mapping what trees I come across and assessing what threats those trees might face or what challenges there are in appropriate management. So so far in the project, I've covered over 1,500 hectares and at the moment, just over 100 new ancient or veteran tree records. I've also recorded some notable, but the vast majority of what I'm finding in the farm landscape is certainly veteran trees, with a small scattering of ancient. And that's pretty much what I was expecting, to be honest. Here is a really interesting example of one of the farms that I've been fortunate enough to survey. This farm covers part of what was historically a deer park. It has a long history of being different forms of wood pasture. It was a medieval deer park and more recently a monastic park. This is a 1800 map where you can see that the area was still being grazed, and you've got a kind of scattering of trees in the landscape. And this is what it looks like today. So obviously it has been converted to arable farmland, but interestingly, there's still pockets of trees within this landscape. And I've been very much focusing on ancient veterans within this landscape, but certainly when you compare it to the historic map, and I'm sorry, I don't think the yellow stars show particularly well, but you can see individual trees that were mapped in 1800 that are still there today. So it's still very much functioning to a certain extent as wood pasture, but interspersed with a very different type of land management. So when we're talking about what impact wider land management have on trees, I think this is a good example. These trees established and matured in a grazed landscape and are now in an arable landscape. So understandably, some of the risks and threat that these trees face are potentially going to come from that change in environment and land management. But they're still there and have high potential as kind of acting as these stepping stones in the wider environment for all of the species that rely on this habitat. So this is generally what I'm finding. So I think these are trees that so often get overlooked because they're not large, significant ancients, such as the major oak and other famous ancient trees. They look a bit battered, not very healthy, as some people might call them, and you know, are very much ignored at the edges of different kind of land management interests, but these very much do provide the wildlife habitat value that our ancients do as well. The risk is they probably don't have as much longevity in them unless we really do kind of support the kind of right conditions for them to continue. So just to briefly cover some of the things that I've come across that I've identified as some of the risks and threats that some of these trees face. So ground compaction is one. So the picture on the left is the Parliament oak. That's actually one part of the tree. It looks like two just mature oaks, but it is actually the remnants of an incredible ancient tree, but you just wouldn't know it seeing it without understanding its history. It's visited quite regularly, but also on a popular dog walking path, so compaction is quite a big issue there. The tree on the right in the middle, it's the same tree. Compaction is another issue. So this happens to be pasture. It's an ancient oak, and it has compaction around the base from livestock, but also it's in complete isolation. There is not another tree within quite some distance of it. So if you're thinking about specialist invertebrates, for example, with short dispersal distances, there's potentially nowhere for them to go once this tree goes. Interestingly, I think it's also a really good example of trees sometimes being perceived as being past it. They've kind of had their time, and obviously the top of this tree blew out at some point. And I think quite reasonably, some people would consider that tree's kind of not really got much life left in it. But actually, what you can see of that green kind of lower crown that's kind of reformed is exactly what kind of trees are capable of doing in the aging process. It has reformed this smaller, lower crown, which is supporting the live wood. And if we manage issues such as compaction around the base of that tree, does have the potential to continue for potentially hundreds of more years. Other issues, lapse management. So the picture on the left is a willow. It will have been pollarded at some point, but hasn't for quite some time, and is collapsing under lack of management, which is a potential risk, which might mean failure of that tree in the near future. Crown competition. So you can see a sweet chestnut in the middle. It's surrounded by other mature trees that are a lot taller. Those other trees are shading out the sweet chestnut, and potentially that tree is going to suffer in a kind of short to medium to long term from lack of light, and could potentially go before its time. And rich soils is another example. So just as Gareth was saying in terms of fertilizer drift, this is an area that has not been, it's not managed, but has certainly been impacted by fertilizer drift, and you've got a lot of nettles and mugwort in there, which indicates in rich soils, which would normally be not very rich in nutrients at all and have a different plant community, and that affects not only the plant community, but as Gareth mentioned, the mycorrhizal associations with that tree potentially. And so what we try to talk about in terms of supporting these ancient and veterans is the root protection area, which has already been mentioned a couple of times. And here's an example of a beautiful ancient tree within an area of farmland. You can see it's thankfully not cultivated right up to the base of the tree. It does have an area around it that isn't cultivated. But if we work out the root protection area, so we recommend 15 times the diameter of the tree. Oh, sorry, this picture just again illustrates how our perception of what the root system looks like is not necessarily really the reality of what a tree does. And here we have sandy soils, so trees are probably more likely to have their root systems going out even further. So the kind of root pattern is pretty much as the kind of reality side on the right outlines, but it is also impacted by species and soil conditions as well. And here in sandy soils, you might expect that root system to reach even further. So a root protection area, we advise 15 times the diameter of the tree. This tree is 1.4 meters. So that's 21 meters, and you can see that's quite significantly different to the area currently afforded that tree. And that's not to say necessarily that 21 meters needs to be a complete area of uncultivated ground, but that's the area that we really need to be considering what land management effects might be having on the tree, such as fertilizer application or ploughing depths as well. So a tree will adjust the depth of its root system below a kind of ploughing depth. But if that's irregularly ploughed to different depths, then that's going to just cause damage to the trees because they can't reform those root systems as quickly as we might change them. So yeah, just to illustrate the drip line as well. So not just thinking about how land management is going to be interacting with the root system of these trees. What's really important is to also be thinking about next generations. So this is from within Sherwood Forest. So this is kind of typical, quite woody wood pasture. So wood pasture is an incredibly diverse habitat and can take many different forms. But here you can see we've got a veteran in the centre, and we've got a lovely open grown mature oak on the left, and then we've got younger generations of oak trees coming through on the right, and all of those are incredibly important, and I would say can be replicated even in an arable environment, just because this image is showing kind of grazed wood pasture. That's not to say that we can't replicate this image in terms of having younger generations, next generation, alongside our veteran trees in an arable environment. And this is really important, the longevity of the important habitats that these provide. So those next generation trees will hopefully at some point in the future start kind of gaining those veteran and ancient features that Emma talked about in her presentation. So just to this is just a bit of a brain dump of some of the actions that you might want to consider to help support ancients or even ancients of the future. I don't think this is limited to places where there are ancient veterans, because all trees have the capacity to be ancients of the future, given the opportunity. So being mindful of access tracks and their proximity to ancient trees can be really important, especially if machinery has potential of kind of causing damage to the tree directly, but certainly ground compaction is an issue. As I say, the root systems will adapt to tracks and compaction. So where there's a long established track, just make sure heavy machinery sticks to that track and doesn't stray into the wider root protection area. Don't prune lower limbs. And this is a really important point, I think, and something I'm seeing quite regularly on arable farms, understandably, where lower branches are potentially being knocked by machinery. And obviously, to avoid that, lower limbs tend to be pruned off to allow the machinery to pass without damaging the tree. But actually, that's also doing is removing the ability of the tree to reform a lower crown, which is a really key kind of survival strategy for trees reaching kind of mature and kind of post-mature and ancient status. So that ability for a tree to form a lower canopy is really important.
Lou, could you perhaps just finish in the next minute or so, because we've got quite a lot of questions.
This is my last slide. Well, there's one more, but this is pretty much it. So plant new open grown trees, care for your mature open grown trees as they're the next generation. Species choice is important. So think about planting species that are site native, and also those similar to ones you already have. Don't think of trees in isolation. So just as Gareth was talking about grassland habitats, a lot of the species that rely on our ancient veteran trees also rely on open habitats, and kind of certainly other species for pollination, for example. Scrubby areas are important. Don't tidy away fallen limbs and leave them whole. So often I see a pile of chopped up limbs under a tree, whereas actually it could have been left whole. And that's really important if possible. If it's not fallen in a very appropriate place, move it somewhere where it is, but ideally don't chop it up if you can help it. And manage crown competition, because light availability is really important. And also don't plant too close. It's really tempting to plant a next generation right next to some of our ancient veterans, but don't forget that tree has got to mature as well, and it will probably reach maturity whilst your ancient veteran is still alive, and then form competition issues. So give these trees space, including with next generations. So the guiding principles are: give a tree space and opportunity to continue to grow old, retain and value dead trees and decaying wood, and look to the future. And just again to name our guide that you might find useful. And that's me done.
Thank you very much, Lou. That was a great trip through, and thank you all for speakers. So we've now got quite a lot of questions, so I'm going to do my best to try and make sure I don't miss any of them. We've got about 20 minutes, but I have been, well, just less, because we have to finish by 12:30 on the dot, apparently, because this Zoom is needed by others. So there are a number of questions, so maybe I'll direct this one to Lou first, but there's a number of questions on the same theme, about the concern about ash dieback and how you manage trees that have caught the disease. And how did you balance that between having the safety for humans along with maintaining the tree for its value as a biodiversity and for the tree itself?
Yeah, I think number one, health and safety comes first. That always needs to be the primary consideration. But what actions you can take to make a tree safe are quite varied. So, for example, if you've got a tree that's at risk of coming down on a path, or on a path, you might want to consider moving your path, for example, or fencing an area off so people aren't at risk of going close to that tree. Or it could be that it is challenging, because I think there's a really broad range of how trees can be affected by ash dieback. Sometimes it can take a long time for them to decline. Sometimes they might look in a process of decline but not get any worse, and others will go within a couple of years. I think leaving them standing as long as possible where is safe is the best advice, and thinking about kind of habitat continuity into the future as well.
And following on from that question, somebody else posted a question about how you actually, as well as the management, but what about the costs involved? Is there any help in with the costs? And I know we've posted in the chat the link to the Tree Council booklet, but I don't know if you've got any thoughts to add on that.
Yeah, I don't know, I'm afraid. I don't have ash in my treescape, so I'm not regularly dealing with it, but well, not to any great extent. So yeah, I'm afraid I'm not sure on that question.
Anybody else on the panel, Catherine or Gareth or Kath, want to add anything? And perhaps you could put your videos back on so we can see all the speakers. Great. No? Okay. So we've also got various questions about from Martin's talk about the various fungi. I don't know, I know you've answered some of them in the chat, Gareth, but whether you would just like to sort of summarise so that everybody can hear in relation to the questions that you were put in the Q&A about the ability to actually analyse the mycorrhizal biodiversity in the soils and the future of that.
Yeah, this is a method we developed here, so it's kind of mostly a research tool now. Costs a few £100 for the analysis of a sample, but I think the costs will probably go down as it's more widely used. It does detect all the fungi, so it detects the arbuscular and the ectomycorrhizal fungi and the wax caps. And it tells you the relative proportions, so you can see if the ectomycorrhizal fungi are increasing in abundance relative to other fungi. So it's quite, you get a lot of information from it. You get many hundreds of species from any sample.
Thanks. Yeah, it sounds like we probably need to hopefully do another talk at next year's Oxford Real Farming Conference, so you can come back on the research that you're doing with the Woodland Trust and update everybody on the progress in this area, because it's such an interesting area. I don't know if anybody in the audience wants to ask any further questions to Gareth at this point, if they want to put hands up. If not, I'll move on into the chat. But I can't see the hands up, so I might need Tigger to help me identify. Susanna, would you like to unmute yourself? Are you there, Susanna? Can you unmute?
I'm just unmuting her now.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, yeah, there we go.
Hello.
Hi, yes, we can hear you.
Hi, great. I've just asked a couple of questions on the chat, actually. So one is just that I'm really interested in the if there's any current evidence around using minimum till or no-till practices in horticulture, because it seems to be a big thing at the moment, and I was wondering what people actually know about how that affects the soil structure and fungi. And a second question is about regenerating land that's been used for intensive agriculture, and whether fungi will still be present in the soil, or if it would be a good idea to try and inoculate the soil, whether inoculations are even available. Thank you.
With inoculations, I think there are various products that are sold. I'm a bit dubious about them. We've had a look at what they actually contain, and often they don't contain much or any of what they claim to contain. Maybe a better way is to transfer some soil from an adjacent woodland into around trees. But these fungi, they can migrate surprisingly quickly. They can blow in the air. So we've looked at uncolonized new islands and found that the fungi, surprisingly, I don't know how they get there, maybe I assume by wind, can colonize fairly quickly. With formerly intensive farmland, what would likely inhibit the development of the desired fungal populations would be very high levels of nutrients, especially phosphorus, because that builds up in the soil with the annual applications. It doesn't often go anywhere. So sometimes people do stripping, they soil strip. They remove the top layer of soil where most of the phosphorus is, and that sort of reduces nutrient levels in the habitat.
Lou, would you like to respond, please?
Yeah, I was just going to follow on from what Gareth said there. We've got a really interesting example here in Sherwood where the National Trust have been undertaking some arable reversion with one of their tenant farmers, and they've been doing that in terms of nutrient stripping. So they kind of sowed a ryegrass mix, and that's been cut and removed to take away the nutrients. I mean, it's sandy soil, so it doesn't really hold on to nutrients particularly well anyway. So it's a quicker process, perhaps on sandy soils than on other soils. But there's certainly lots of kind of projects out there that are looking to do that because for exactly the reason Gareth just said, in terms of the kind of soil communities are so very much dictated by those nutrient values.
Thanks, Lou. I mean, there's another question, I think, from Jackie, which is linked to this, which says, our ancient grassland with 2 great old oaks used to produce red wax caps, but I've seen none in recent years. The new management of the farm has included herbicide against creeping thistle once or twice. Will this have done the damage, and will the wax caps return with wiser management? So, I don't know, Gareth, do you want to look at that first?
I wouldn't write them off yet. These things are very long-lived organisms. I don't know if any of you are familiar with park grass, which is the world's oldest agricultural experiment in Rothamsted. And that was ploughed until 1815. And then about 50 years later, it was surveyed for the fungi. And some of the wax caps weren't observed at that stage, but they are there now. So it can take them maybe up to a century to establish. So they're very long-lived organisms, and they don't need to fruit every year. It's just like you don't see, I mean, the mushroom is just like the acorn on a tree. So quite often, there's not many acorns this year, hereabouts anyway. So don't worry too much. Often if the grass is very long, the wax caps won't fruit, but the mycelium underneath, where 99% of the biomass is probably quite healthy. So I wouldn't get too depressed about your field just yet.
Okay, thanks, Gareth. And then I think similarly, Margaret has highlighted her concern based in Powys about poultry manure, which is being used untreated and is becoming a problem. So I'm not sure, obviously, this link to the high nutrient content. So I'm not sure whether anybody, but Gareth, you want to make any comments on that?
Yeah, lots of people are very concerned about this, not least because the effects on the rivers has been terrifying. And I'm sure they are having other effects as well. Ray Woods has highlighted the problems on the lichens on the surfaces of the trees and how they're being damaged very badly by all this airborne nitrogen. We've got a project with Woodland Trust that is a separate one from the one I talked about, looking at the change to the fungi on the leaf surfaces inside the leaves. And we're also looking at the ectomycorrhizal fungi in that. And I think there would be damage. Whether we will detect it clearly is another matter.
Yeah, no, thank you. Right, I'm just trying to scroll through the questions. So I think somebody did talk about not having heard about the fact that fertilizer spread, etc., can cause damage, and what could we do more about to disseminate the information so that lots more people are aware of this. So I don't know if you've, perhaps that's a question to all of you, what ideas could we have for organisations like ourselves to disseminate this advice, but also what role might new government policy have in educating and in raising an awareness of the things that we can all do as farmers and land managers to protect our ancient and veteran trees. So who would like to go first? Gareth, as you're unmuted, do you want to?
not sure really on that one. I was thinking about an answer to Lydia's question.
Okay, well, I'll leave you then. How about Lou, as you're practically out there advising, working with farmers? Is that something that you feel that farmers are lacking understanding on some of the impacts that they might be having on these trees?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think the farmers I'm working with very much value the trees on their farm, and I think are perhaps unaware of some of the indirect impacts that they're having from wider land management. And that's not through a lack of caring. So I think it's about we need more of a conversation around the role that trees play in the farmed environment. And I think hopefully any future grant support would help drive that conversation as well. There's a growing body of resources available to farmers, but I think it's just us all talking and exploring kind of ways of mitigating impacts as well as the issues.
Thank you. Catherine, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was going to say that I think that this session is exactly what we need, a great first step. So it's just, getting the information out there, and particularly the research and the projects that are happening, sharing their findings. I think that's really important.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm conscious of time because I think I'm supposed to be wrapping up in a couple of minutes. I think Martin did post a question. Obviously, you help farmers, Martin, put in their BPS applications, and you're very frustrated about the fact that the aerial checks keep changing, grazed wood pasture with good grass understory back to woodland. And that's not directly what I kind of posed at the end of my introductory piece, but I think there is probably a role here for policy underpinned with regulation. We need to make sure that these trees are seen as eligible features that not only are protected, but farmers are incentivized and rewarded for looking after them. So I'm not sure they've got all the answers yet. I mean, I'm part of the stakeholder engagement groups that are trying to influence elm in England. And certainly we were optimistic that protection for infield trees seemed to be included in some of the original pilots for the SFI, the Sustainable Farming Incentive, but we're very concerned when more detail came out in December to say that those particular standards didn't appear to be being rolled out into the main scheme. So, I think that's a good example there where we've seemed to have made some headway with DEFRA in terms of acknowledging that these trees all infield trees, so the future and the current special trees are important, but that message doesn't seem to have got embedded as yet. So there's still a lot of work to be done. I think I'm going to have to draw this session to close. I found it fascinating, and I hope you all have too. I think we've had, I'd like to thank all speakers, and we will pass on our thanks to Emma, who wasn't able to actually participate in person today. I think it's been a really good mixture of research and practical experience working there with farmers. So we have got an exhibition area on the Oxford Real Farming Conference platform, which my colleague Kath is monitoring. So please, for those questions that we haven't got to or we haven't answered fully, please do go and put your questions in the chat there, and also take a look at the materials that we've been talking about, which are also available there. I'd really thank you for all your participation, and again, thank the speakers. And yeah, this is the beginning. We did run a session at Groundswell last year, which Lou and Emma led, which was a practical workshop, and we were absolutely blown away by the 80 odd people that turned up at 9 o'clock on the first day to participate. So there's a real interest in this area, and it's a really important area. So thank you again, and thank you Oxford Real Farming Conference for allowing us to put this session on.